listening to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Transformation in Trials podcast. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Lars Rosendal. And Lars is the VP of Clinical Operations at LEO Pharmaceuticals. Hi, Lars. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Sam, and good morning, Ivana. Thanks for having me here.
Look, we're really excited to get into this discussion with you, Lars. And the topic that we want to cover today for this episode is trial execution in an uncertain drug development landscape, and really to hear your perspectives from a mid-sized pharmaceutical company. So we're going to learn a lot about you and your background, but we're going to center the discussion around this topic. And to get us started, perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about what the current drug development landscape looks like for mid-sized pharmaceutical companies, and then how this might differ from what you've seen in the past.
Sure, happy to. So if we think about drug development and how much it has developed over the last couple of centuries, basically, it is now very much, in my opinion, an innovation game. And what that means to me is that it is about creating drugs that differentiate from what is already on the market, what is already available to the patients, because society and patients seem to be looking for a real improvement in standard of care. And they also seem to be willing to actually pay for innovation, because obviously this is a costly journey. And that means that what we try as a pharma company to do just means that we will be competing on exactly the same timelines and ambitions. And if we kind of look back, this has probably changed for companies like ourselves, that historically we did a little bit more life cycle management or repurposing of drugs that were already, on the market or close to the market. Now it's really about, in my opinion, again, developing real innovative solutions that have not been tried and tested before.
That is interesting, because this whole topic of evergreening and reusing the same drugs for new indications has been the modus operandi for our industry for quite a long time. Do you know why there is a shift towards more innovation?
Yeah, I think, we have done a tremendous efforts and tremendous progress as an industry in helping many, many patients. And therefore, if you look at many of the larger kind of therapeutic areas, many, many patients are actually pretty well served. And we also know that, you have your patent protection for a certain period of time. And once that is kind of over, it becomes a very different price game for other types of companies coming in and reproducing. And that just means that we need to push the innovation to be able to bring something that is either much better in the efficacy part, or much safer to take and less side effects on the basically adverse event side. And I think that's why it's being pushed for innovation. We call it it's either best in class, so a compound that will beat what is on the market on the two parameters I mentioned, or that it's first in class, so that you get first to the market in a certain class type.
That must impact pretty early on in the value stream in a pharmaceutical company, starting already with the early research, that we look at completely different kinds of drug candidates.
Yeah, it does. And I think the thing that I'm trying to plan for and think quite a bit about is that when you have this ambition of innovation, also means that there's a lot of uncertainty. Drug development as a whole is uncertain. Most of the compounds that we put into the clinic never makes it to the market. So it's like, 10% that makes it to the market, and even fewer that becomes a commercial success. But having this with best or first in class means that the uncertainty level just goes through the roof. It means that you'll be putting compounds, you have less information around the mode of action into the testing. And that means that you need to be ready to face more failures early in your clinical development. And obviously, as an organization, we need to think about how do we do that in a meaningful way as an organization.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think pharma has this reputation of being risk adverse, and what you're describing here, there's a lot at stake, right? You put all your eggs potentially in one basket, you put your chips on certain plays, and if they go wrong, where does that leave you?
Yeah, and I guess that's also why the game is slightly different for different types of company. I mean, if you look at the big pharma companies, they have quite deep pockets. They can afford failures here and there and still fund. Whereas small, for the really small companies, it's either do or die. Basically, if you have one compound that you bring into the clinic and it doesn't work, well, then the company may not exist. Whereas the mid-pharma is, and that's probably where LEO Pharma is based, is in between, where we can absolutely afford a number of failures. However, we have an organizational size also that we need to cater for balancing these failures and make sure that it's still a space that you can grow and develop, and where we don't constantly need to change the organization, basically.
Interesting.
Does this also require that we run different kinds of clinical trials if we work with more uncertain drug candidates?
Yeah, I think, actually in the last 10 years, something has happened in the designs where we look more to, for instance, explore a compound that we think affects some kind of biological pathway that could be relevant to multiple diseases. That is actually the ideal development target for a company, where you have different opportunities to go into different indications. In the last, let's say, 10 years, more and more trials of these types, where you then explore going into multiple indications at the same time and testing out where does it work well, where's the best balance between your effect and your safety, has arisen. Whereas historically, we kind of tested one indication, then went through development, then perhaps made a line extension on another indication. So there is some progress on the design and how we take that uncertainty into account.
And best in class, first in class, they sound like good headlines potentially on a strategic PowerPoint deck to investors and to the wider organization. How do you then break that down and operationalize that in terms of the activities that maybe lead towards those lofty goals?
Yeah, I think, when we say best in class and first in class, it is about bringing that innovation to market in a timely way, basically. And when we think about it, for a company our size, we are roughly 5,000 individuals in the company. We try to manage that, or a big part of how we aspire to do this in an effective way is that we try to balance that risk that we have that comes with these uncertainties of the classes of the compounds, and think about how can we bring the compounds as fast as possible towards new defining marks. So with new defining marks, and if we go back and think about clinical development as a whole, we try to test the compounds first in typically healthy subjects. That's called phase 1, where you see where you see basically whether it's safe to be exposed to the compound. Then you go into what we call phase 2, which is basically where you first time expose patients of your target indication to the compound to see, now it's fairly safe. Does it also affect the biological pathway that you're trying to affect? That's kind of where you have breakpoint that you call proof of concept. Proof of concept is that it works in your target indication. Then you have the second part of that phase 2 that is defining what is the ideal, let's say, strength of your compound, which is always a balance of effect and safety matters. And then you have another point where you decide, now I'm going to go into what we call phase 3. That is we call it confirmatory trials. They are very, very large and therefore also very, very costly. And therefore you have a very important decision point to take there. Do you have enough information? Are you confident enough in your compound that it does what you want it to do and that it can make a difference in the market before you start investing in your phase 3?
How do you, if you have these aspirations to have a best-in-class or first-in-class asset or new drug to the market, how does that impact things operationally in terms of your drug delivery process across the whole pharma value chain?
Yeah, no, good point. So some of the things we have considered with our strategy of launching best and first-in-class compounds is that we need to diversify, let's say, our risk profile. And that means that strategically on our clinical side, we have decided to create a strategic partnership with a CRO that can help us in the earlier parts of drug development. So the earlier parts is what I called before phase 1. And then in this case, up to proof of concept. So as we talked about before, the proof of concept is where you know that your compound has a positive effect on the disease you're trying to modify. Now, if we look at how the industry is operating, we have what we call typically a valley of death, actually in the early parts of phase 2, where many compounds do not make it past that proof of concept. So our strategic decision has been that we create a strategic partnership for the earlier parts. So we outsource basically end to end to one global partner, phase 1 and 2A, up to a proof of concept. If we get a proof of concept, then we take internal control of the later parts of clinical development. So your 2B and your phase 3. Because here we want to own, let's say, drive the speed forward, but also be in contact with the investigators that have the compound in their hands so that they get experience with the compound. We start creating advocacy around the compound if it's a good compound. And it's a kind of a nice segue into hopefully a launch mode that another part of the company would go into. So that's kind of how we have managed this uncertainty. We've basically said, okay, somebody else needs to help us on the earlier parts. And once we know that it's likely to work, then we take internal control. And that's kind of how we put some of the risk that is associated with this onto our strategic partner and let them scale up and down for the earlier, more risky parts.
I've seen the other companies in the same size starting to include some of their commercial colleagues earlier on, even when designing the portfolio of trials that they're planning to run, that you also have this market access and a commercial perspective. Have you done any kinds of experiments like that?
Yeah, now we are treading on something challenging. So let me just make sure that we think about this rightly. So as it comes to the design of clinical trials, of course, our commercial colleagues are part of that because, I'm in research and development, and obviously we can develop something to the market, but if it doesn't fulfill the needs of our commercial colleagues to be able to go out and argue that this compound can do something special that the other compounds cannot do, then it's never going to be a commercial success. So obviously our commercial colleagues are deeply involved when we talk about how do we design the development program, what are the key claims that we need to have, and what is the supporting documentation you would need to have enough to go out to both payers, but also society and obviously health authorities to argue that this is a compound that will make a difference to patients. Then on top of that, so that's kind of on the design element, we're actually collaborating quite closely with what we call the medical science liaisons in LEO Pharma that are within the research and development organization. So it's not a commercial, let's say, group. It's more scientific group that also works with key investigators in the market. So we team up with them, and where on some of the trials we work very closely together. For instance, they could be part of when we start up a site, be part of the discussion with the site staff. For instance, explain the mode of action because they come from a very deep scientific ground. And this is the way that we also try to bridge to, let's say, the life cycle stage once on the market, because they would still be interacting with these investigators. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the medical function is a very interesting one in this scenario, because they kind of bridge the R&D side of things and the commercial side of things from a scientific perspective, yet don't quite belong in either one.
Yeah, you're very right. And we've seen that sometimes they're based in the commercial side. But we've kind of, in our organization or in LEO Pharma, decided that it's an R&D organization also to be able to support so closely the development activities.
I had a follow-up question, Lars, to the strategy that you outlined really clearly in terms of outsourcing up to proof of concept and then taking in-house. How do you decide whether to do it that way or whether the opposite way makes more sense? And would the opposite way ever make more sense?
Actually, it's a phenomenal question, Sam, because when you look at across the industry, different companies have very different models. Actually, some companies choose the model that you depict, where they take more of the internal control of the earlier parts, because there it's more about learning about the compound. They want to be really close to that and really make sure that they learn everything that is to be learned, so that the later part of the development is, designed ideally. So there are absolutely companies that does that. In our way, we basically argued that we need to ensure that we're successful in the later parts of the development. And if we think about it, and from our perspective or also past experience, we've been fairly successful, actually quite good at running fast in the later parts of development, potentially because LEO Pharma is also a company that has been in the same therapeutic area for a really long time. So we're very well connected with the sites, and there's generally a good, respectful, mutual understanding, and they seem to want to support our journey when we come with new development programs. So we've been fairly successful in running fast in the later parts of development, and obviously there you want to go as fast as at all possible so you get quickly to the market. So this is the balance we have decided in our company, that for now we are focusing on driving the speed of execution in the later parts with internal resources.
Got it. No, that's clear. And I think I would imagine when you make big changes from an organizational standpoint, it has the potential to cause a little bit of uncertainty. And with that, you need solid leadership, right? So I'd like to sort of explore the topic of leadership with you a little bit, Lars. And maybe we could start off by hearing a little bit about your background, what got you into your current role, and finishing up with how you define leadership in this space as well.
My background, I would say that I'm basically a clinical trialist by both training, passion, and heart. And what that means is that I trained as a human physiologist, so somewhere in between biology and medicine, because I'm super passionate about, what happens to the body under different kinds of stress, what happens at a cellular level, etc. And that actually took me to a research background. Initially did a PhD. But after that, I thought I would like to go broader, have a broader profile. So wanted to apply my knowledge in the pharma industry. So started up in a CRO, got to learn the ropes of site management, being a CRA, and then got into project management, designing clinical trials. And then basically it's been a path of different types of responsibilities. At a fairly early stage, actually, we're two persons who did a management buyout of a phase 1 unit. So I was at the time focused on the initial parts of clinical development. And it was at the times where a few years after the Tegenero case in the UK, where there was a big push to have clinical pharmacology units close to the hospitals. So we made a management buyout of this clinical pharmacology unit, brought it into a university hospital in Denmark, and partnered up with that hospital, gave a training ground for their clinical pharmacologists, and in that way created a really nice partnership where they owned the facilities, we operated the clinic, brought experience and everything into it, but in that way created a really nice learning background for us as a company, but also for the university hospital as a training ground. And then I got into later stages of clinical development, if you will, and ended up leading global clinical operations here at LEO Pharma.
I think it's interesting that you started in the very early stages of the clinical life cycle. And I think that's important for someone who only operated phase 3 clinical trials. It can be very hard to imagine what does this look like in the very early stages.
Yeah, no, super good point, Ivar. And I think that's, so some of the things that I have enjoyed as part of my career is to be exposed to different parts of the clinical development. And they are unique, all of them, and they bring their own challenges and also, appreciations and opportunities. And I think having been able to been through the whole, let's say, spectrum from first in man on to, putting to the market and beyond, gives you a broader understanding of why it's important to think about different data elements as part of your journey. So fully agree with you there.
You're a leader in LEO Pharmaceuticals. You've been involved in a lot of organizational change. What does leadership mean to you in a mid-sized pharmaceutical company? And can you talk to us about some of the leadership decisions and challenges perhaps that you've had to face along the way?
Happy to do so, Sam. So if we think about leadership generally, and if we look, we may not have covered that initially, but if we look at drug development, it is to a large extent, I talked about the innovation game, but it's also a horse race. It is about getting fast, but of course with quality data through your development phases to basically protect your time on patent, but also to beat your competition. When we look at kind of development, it seems to, when new classes of compounds are discovered, they happen quite close to each other. So basically multiple companies have the same starting point in terms of time. And therefore it is a horse race to get to the market quicker than your competition. And to be able to do that, to turn it into your leadership question, to me, leadership plays an enormous important role in creating the foundation that allows for having an organization that can run with speed. So basically effective and efficient, but also create a culture that fertilizes the collaboration that is going to allow you to run fast, but also solve the issues that arise. So basically tearing down some of the silos that naturally exist in larger organizations, but also create an organization that is, where there's a deep sense of purpose in the organization so that every single employee feels that they are making a unique difference to the company and to the patient journey of bringing the compound to the patients. So I think that is the responsibility of leadership, to fertilize the grounds that allows everybody to see the role that they have, but also be super clear and super sharp on that here we expect to collaborate and we expect to do it smart and efficient and fast.
Yeah. How have you worked with the culture of your organization to make sure that people feel that kind of ownership and responsibility for their role and making that difference to the patients in the end?
So I think, and every leader has their own recipe. And mine is I'm very, very passionate about the patient, and it resonates so well to me. Now, LEO Pharma is a dermatology-focused company, and I had a dermatology disease when I was a kid and basically into adulthood. So obviously it resonates with me, making a difference to patients that don't have the right options. So, and I'm trying to set the scene to allow to create that message, and everybody have their own narrative, whether they've been a patient themselves or not, but understand the journey or their contribution to making an ultimate difference to the patients. And obviously in the clinical space and clinical operations, we are probably the closest to patients we get. So quite often we get, feedback from investigators just sharing a mail from a patient that was on a clinical trial, etc. And often they primarily do that when it's good results, obviously. But think about that how much energy that releases in people seeing what a difference it makes to patients and individuals. So I talk a lot about the patient journey and help people be reminded that while we're behind the desk, we're trying to make a tangible difference for patients out there. So that's probably the first thing. The second thing is to be very transparent and be very, present with our team. We have a global team, so these days it's very much about, team meetings. For those that are based in the same locality, we also walk to each other's, the spaces to enable interaction. But we be visible, talk about that deep purpose. And then I think I said before also collaboration. In my opinion, the better we collaborate, the better we are able to see, okay, somebody's struggling over here, I have the competencies to support him or her, the quicker we get through the issues that always are in every project that is being run. So I focus, and the leadership team focus a lot around collaboration and breaking down the silos. When somebody puts up, this is not my role, somebody needs to fix it, we kind of say, hey, but could you help? Do you have the capabilities to actually help? Then go help. I mean, so that we really, on the very practical and strategic level, try to tear down the silos. It's super hard, but it's a very important focus of ours.
No, that's great, Lars. And I think one of the things that triggered me to reach out to you about coming onto our podcast was we'd see it was well publicized on LinkedIn that you'd made some changes within your leadership team and moved people from different positions. So perhaps you could share, first of all, what you did and your thought process around it, and maybe what you're expecting to see off the back of making those changes.
Yeah, no, it was a really interesting journey. So perhaps to take you back to some of the rationales, if we think also about the industry and organizations, we've talked, in the last couple of years about the big resignation, and we do see industry-wise and across multiple industries that the turnover rate is increasing. And that is actually not super good, because every time people leaves, it requires new training of new people. Obviously, it also brings in new blood and new ideas. But if the turnover rate is too high, you lose efficiency and effectiveness, which is important to be able to run fast. So some of the things we did as part of designing that new organization is to think about also on a leadership level, how can we keep people motivated? How can we keep developing people? And also, if we think about the slightly younger segment of people, they typically look for constant challenge, constant development. Otherwise, they will sometimes at least go look for other opportunities outside. So I'm also trying to create an organization where these opportunities arise and where we focus on the ability to try to move people between different areas. And Ivana, this is what we talked about before, that personally I've seen, a lot of the clinical development side and have experience from different elements, but can we structurally cater for that? Can we put people structurally around in different areas so they get different experiences and therefore get a more holistic view on clinical drug development? So practically what we did is that I wanted to and needed to make some changes to the leadership structures, but also in the team that we have some very, very capable, very, very skilled leaders, but who also, if you think about the S curve of learning, they're kind of at their mastery, the top level, basically, at the bottom we start with not knowing very much, being inexperienced, and then you come to, starting to be able to know your role on where you get on your steep part of your learning curve, and then you get to the mastery, where your learning curve is very slow. You're very good at what you do, but you don't learn much new. So one of the ambitions were to change everybody's learning curve, bring them down on the learning curve, get to the more steep part, both because it's very energizing and engaging to get the opportunity to learn new stuff, but also it keeps you sharp and gives you a broader experience of what drug development is all about. So practically what we did is that for all of the directors, and here it's probably worth noting that they are leaders of leaders. So there's a first level layers that are deep experts. That we basically moved everybody around, so everybody got a new functional area that they were not experts in. But also most of their colleagues were still in that team that previously was experts in exactly that area. So what it does, in my opinion, it's still early days, but what it does is that it creates this learning environment, but it also drives a collaboration within the team, that you suddenly have a colleague who knows more than yourself, and you would, I think, lean on that individual for making some of the important decisions for your new functional area, basically because you don't know everything. So what I was envisioning that would do is create an environment that breaks down these silos, create a culture where collaboration is king and where people at the same time grows. So that was the philosophy around making these changes.
Well, I really love that approach, and also because what we really need in clinical, in the whole clinical space, is more experimentation and more innovation. And I think that's so clever that you thought about how can I create that sense of curiosity and that need for collaboration, and actually finding a way that's level the playing field for everyone in your organization.
Yeah, and I must also say that, and initially they were really welcoming that idea about, okay, being challenged with new opportunities, but also having, people to go to for knowledge and expertise. Obviously, what we see is also that it takes quite a lot of time to get in under the skin of a new area and really understand it deep down. So one of the things we just need to be mindful of in that journey is that you take a little bit out productivity initially as people grow into their roles. What it does, however, it allows the first line managers to step up and take more of that, professional control, and it gives them greater opportunity to step up. So we've actually seen an interesting dynamic that while people are getting to know their area, the first line managers are stepping up and also taking larger control, and therefore being also, more engaged and learning new stuff in their roles. But it does take a little bit of productivity out. I just want to warn that. I still think that it is, in the longer run, a phenomenal investment in people and in development and in holistic perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really bold move. I also think it forces people to ask really great questions as well, because if you don't know the answer, you have to legitimately ask the question with total curiosity in mind rather than any preconceived ideas, which can sometimes kind of bias you. So, yeah, we'll be curious to see how it all plays out in the coming months and years, but I think it's a great move. I want to talk a bit about technology. It's a topic close to my heart. But what do you see, Lars, about the role of technology as the clinical trial landscape starts to become more complex? And I think specifically, there's a lot of talk about decentralized trials. And of course, there's a technology component to that. Could you maybe share some of your views on that topic too?
Sure. To be able to do that, probably worth going back, just reiterating, if we think about drug development, it is a high risk, high cost, but also high award space. So you risk investing a lot of money into something that ends up failing late, and we don't never recoup that. And I think, and that's a point you brought up earlier that I didn't, really address, but you talked about the slow pace of the industry as a whole, the conservatism of the industry. And I very much agree that because of the high cost elements, we tend to become less good at managing kind of that uncertainty. And that means that we've basically done drug development more or less in the same way the last 20 or 30 years. Now we are seeing significant changes that is driven by technology, which was your question. If we think, for instance, about the research elements, actually we see a larger degree of application of AI in the understanding of the compounds to be able to better understand it and increase the probability of success as it moves into the clinic. So there we have actually in the last 10 years seen a lot of movement and a lot of advancement in that. Then once we get to the clinic and you ask the question about DCT, And I'll share that with you, that I'm also super passionate about DCT. So for non-experts, that's decentralized clinical trials. And probably worthwhile also saying that in a classical clinical trial, the patient would come from their home or their work, go to the hospital for every single visit, sit in the waiting room, wait for a nurse to come, take a few samples, wait a little bit more, and sometimes a lot more, wait for the physician and have their test taking and talk to the physician, etc. So sometimes a visit can take 2, 3, 4 hours for every patient. And if we think about it, one of the reasons that development is slow is also that there are too few patients who are willing to participate in clinical research. And actually, people are willing, but it has become so complicated for each patient to participate that if we can lower the boundary of that participation, for instance, with DCT, and that would in this example be that you don't have to go to the hospital. You can pick up the phone and see the physician, see the nurse, talk about the things, register potentially adverse events, etc. There are a lot of things that technology these days can do, that where you can do a lot of stuff without having to go to the hospital every time. That, in my opinion, will make a big difference to the patients in terms of lowering the barrier of participating in clinical research. So therefore, that's one of the reasons that I'm very passionate about it. I do think, however, that it's also been a little bit of a buzzword, and that it takes quite a bit more than the talk that I'm doing here in fancy slides to actually get it to work in real life, because patients are also different. We now learn, as we get more experience with DCT, that actually a fairly large portion of the patients also like to see their physician in person. So we need to find the balance around how much of the trial can we decentralize to make it easier for the patients, and how much do we take advantage of also, let's say, the good old school face-to-face interaction between site staff and patients. But I'm a fan, Sam and Ivana, of the technology and the ambition to change the slow pace of drug development by applying new technologies. But we still need to have solid, documented evidence that it is the golden nugget.
Yeah, and this is definitely a space where much more exploration is needed, and we need more innovation. We need to find ways to integrate that with the clinical methodologies. It's about finding that nice balance. Well, Lars, I think this is a perfect segue to a question that we always ask our guests, and that is, if we gave you a magic wand that would give you one wish that would change something specific in the pharmaceutical industry, what would you wish for?
So apart from finding a phenomenal compound that makes a ton of difference to a number of patients, I'll save that because I think that's obvious. Being in drug development, that would be so rewarding, I think. But if I could wish one thing and have the magical one, I'd actually hope that we've been talking a lot about that we want to be patient-centric. DCTs is part of being patient-centric, but my personal hope would be that we become even more patient-centric in our design of the whole clinical development programs, that we let the patients in earlier, actually try to understand what they need so that we can develop what actually makes a difference to them, and not just take them in, from time to time, but really integrate patient understanding, patient insights into clinical development. I think that would be a whole new area for me. That would be drug development with patients for patients. I think that would be very, very exciting.
I would agree. That would really make a difference. Well, Lars, this was a really interesting conversation. And if some of our listeners have additional questions or are curious to learn more about you, where can they reach out to you?
Thanks, Ivana. Obviously, I have a LinkedIn profile, as Sam also mentioned before, but otherwise, I also have a company email where you're welcome to reach out. It's lrxdk@leo, LEO -pharma, pharma.com. Don't know if that translated well on the phone here, but otherwise I'm sure we can write it into the comments.
Lars, thank you so much for coming on our show.
It was my pleasure. It was lovely talking to you. Thanks a lot, guys, and have a great day.
Thanks, Lars.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Lars Rosendal on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.